Well, so glad you guys are here. My name is Andrew Muller. I'm the administrator of the St. Louis Teen Eagles. You are in for an absolute treat tonight. We are so blessed and thankful to have back once again our good friend, Mr. Dan Ford, who is, and you're going to be enthralled with this presentation. It's going to be very informative. I promise you're going to walk away knowing at least 100 things you didn't know walking in. And if you can remember 3 of them, 3 big points, I'd be more than happy. I'm going to give them a proper introduction in a minute. But we start every single Teen Eagles meeting with a prayer, a pledge, a scripture. We're thankful to the Lord for placing us in America. We know that the eternal liberty that we enjoy exclusively through Jesus and his death, burial, and resurrection on the cross is of the utmost and eternal value. But subsequently, we're also thankful that he's placed us in America and the liberties and the principles that he instilled in this land for a specific purpose and mission. And we're thankful to be part of that and to be here. We don't take that lightly. So I'm going to invite up Teen Eagle Vice President Jackson Green, who is going to lead us in the prayer, and then we'll have Ben, who's our Teen Eagle President, lead us in scripture. So Jackson, if you want to come up and lead us in prayer.
Please bow your heads. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing us all together today so that we can be more informed about the history of our great country. And thank you for letting us be in this country. Even though there are some bad things going on currently, thank you for giving us the power to change them. Please help us walk away from this meeting with a renewed sense of passion for our country.
Amen. Elijah, would you like to come up and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Please stand for the pledge. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And now I'm going to ask Ben, Teen Eagle Vice President, to lead us in a little just scripture reflection. So it's not exactly on the same topic, but I thought it was interesting. So tonight I'd like to share a few verses. The first is Matthew 11, 20 through 30, and the second is 2 Thessalonians 3:18. Matthew 11, 20 through 30 says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is comfortable, and my burden is light." And 2 Thessalonians 3:13 says, "But as for your brothers and sisters, do not grow weary doing good." So the theme I kind of wanted to discuss was weariness before accepting Jesus' yoke and culture. And there have been a lot of times when I've been tired or weary and a little bit burnt out. And I think one of the things you got to remind yourself of is you got to take up the yoke of Jesus continually. You got to continually accept his peace. And I guess that's it. It's good. Yeah. Appreciate that, Ben. And as we think about, what Ben said about our country and the burdens we face as a nation, it can be very easy to get burnt out and to feel discouraged and get apathetic about, the state of the nation. We can't do anything. We're just one small group of people. There's no hope for us as a country. What can we do? But I actually get a little bit encouraged when I see times getting hard, and when I see the truth being suppressed, because we're ripe for a miracle. And isn't that the history of America? It is a small group of reverent, ardent believers and patriots believing in a supreme being and focusing and returning to absolute fundamental principles over and over again. And as the waves of culture and cancel culture and whatever it may be, censorship, persecution, there's certain absolutes that never change. Some of these we're endowed by a creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. These are the type of ideas that undergird the American idea. And that's that rights, principles, truth comes from God. Amen. Not government, not man. And it's always been, it seems, in the history of America, a smaller group that truly believed that and worked towards that, and God's used that. So we shouldn't be discouraged
when things get bad and times get tough and history gets erased and revised and the truth is suppressed, because I think that means that we're ripe for a miracle. And I think that's encouraging. And but a part of that comes responsibility. And that's responsibility of knowing what those principles are, knowing what that history is, so that we can share it with others and help the cause. And I'm so encouraged and blessed that we have Mr. Dan Ford here, who is an author. He has 2 books that are fantastic. If you're not familiar with Pillar is an educational research organization. We exist to promote the biblical Christian worldview and America's Christian heritage. We have free supplemental classes for homeschooling community. We have a lending library right to these walls that happens to have multiple copies of both of Mr. Ford's books. You're welcome to look at those and become a patron of our library. It's free, open to the homeschooling community. But he's an author, he's a writer, he's an illustrator, he's a collector, Mr. Ford is, of rare documents and artifacts, and he has come and presented at Pillar every year for many years on his book, The Legacy of Liberty and Property. I don't know if you've ever given a presentation specifically on your book, In the Name of God, Amen, but the idea of it's the Pilgrim Principles, which you touch on in many of your presentations. But recently, and I think you've probably had an interest in this in a long time, but the space race and communism versus the West, because there's really no principle that's more polar opposite than Christianity than Marxism and communism.
Amen.
It's the exact opposite.
Right.
So it's a really good study to understand, and he has illustrated and documented this, because he's an illustrator by trade. That's what Mr. Ford does. So he has collected all of these original documents, artifacts, and he has stuff all the way back to the 1600s with the foundations and seeds of liberty in Europe coming over to America with the Pilgrims, on to the Great Awakenings in America, Revolutionary War. And that's what we usually hear from him. But this is the first time he's given a presentation on the space race, communism versus the West, and all this beautiful stuff you see up here about the Apollo missions and NASA. And we're just really excited about this. So he's going to take up the whole meeting and speak. We might have some time for the questions at the end, but I am just going to hand it over to Mr. Ford because I don't want to take up any of his precious time. So if you will join me in welcoming Mr. Dan Ford.
Don't be discouraged about being small and starting with little things, because the Lord always orchestrates what He's going to do through individuals just being faithful to Him. You don't look at the size because you don't know how the Lord's going to use you. And that's the story of our founding. That's other topics I talked about that I was prompted to say that. We just be faithful in the stations that the Lord puts us. And He is the master orchestrator of what He's going to do. But He will use small people and large people, important people, not important people on the scale of public appearance, but He orchestrates it all. We would not be a country if He did otherwise. Totally unrelated to tonight's topic, I ran across this little poster. This is just something I downloaded on the internet. Just to show that I'm not a partisan Republican. This is actually a Democrat poster from 1947. So we're to vote because inflation means depression. So if you are against inflation, you might want to take the advice of this Democrat and vote accordingly. Very interesting to me how the political winds blow back and forth. But my topic tonight is God's providence. Normally I do bigger sweeps of history. I got more stuff here than I even knew I owned. I keep this stuff in file cabinets and whatnot. But this is kind of a narrow topic for me. Never spoke on it, so I may be an hour. I might be longer. I might run out of time. Don't know yet, because I've never ever spoken on this, but it's a passion I have, and that is the ideological and political component of the space race. Now, the space race is always covered with the technology, and I love that. I'm a geek when it comes to technology and engineering stuff. There is nothing compared to what was accomplished in the 1960s to put Americans on the moon. They invented the technology. I mean, the stuff that goes on with NASA and China and Russia today all borrowed from what was laid. And I'm a graphic artist, I'll touch it. They changed the whole digital world. They changed everything. because there was an effort for us to beat the Russians to the moon. So that's the subject is a space race, and this is a good illustration from Time magazine of December 1968. Again, an illustration by someone, I think they did a pretty good job illustrating the race. Here's an American and a Russian cosmonaut, American astronaut, racing for the moon. This is right before the Apollo 8. If you're familiar with the space race at all and the Apollo missions, Apollo 8 was the first time that human beings went beyond Earth orbit and actually ascended out towards another heavenly body, because the goal of the space race was the moon, to land on the moon. And that would have political significance and prestige, as well as ideological implications. And it's not that America started out in the 1950s or whatever with their rocket programs early on or after World War II and said, we are going to go to the moon. That was the last thing they were thinking. But it was kind of set up by the communists in the way they were playing. So we got into the space race. Well, we're going to cover a little bit of that. Again, I don't know of any talk that's been done, certainly not from a Christian point of view, on the ideological aspects of this. And again, when I talk about ideological, I don't talk about or mean that all the Americans are Christians and they have this Christian worldview and that's what got us to the moon. That the basic foundations of our freedom that Andrew was talking about are based on Christian principles, and they are diametrically opposed to totalitarian. So we have, if I can fast forward just a little bit, something that I think would be worth reviving. This is a little envelope that was taken on June 3rd, 1965 to the post office in Cape Canaveral, and this guy put together this little mimeograph. Very crude, very basic view of the first American that walked in space. This is a Gemini Capsule, the Gemini program. We'll talk about it a little bit. This guy did it on the day that he was launched, the day that this American walked in space. I blew it up here because he was tethered to his capsule as he walked in space. It was an enthralling experience to do that. But it says, the lifeline of the free world. Now that is important for us to understand. The way we, and I remember the 60s, I remember the late 50s, I remember all this. I was 14 years old when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and people were enthralled with it, those of you that remember. But the idea that free world versus tyranny. America was the epitome of the free world. Everyone looked to us. So it was a very important mindset to know there was the free world and there was the world of bondage, which was basically communism or totalitarian forms of government in any way. I wish that would be, you don't hear that put that way, but it was just common talk in the 60s, this idea of the free world versus tyranny. That's what the space race was about. Now, to set this up, in case you don't know, America won the space race. This is a local paper. This is a local Democrat. It was the more Republican-leaning newspaper in St. Louis at the time, and it says, Apollo 11 and Luna 15 in a tight race to glory. Interesting wording on that, because the Russians knew they could not land a man on the moon before the Apollo 11 mission, but in desperation, in fact, their big rocket they had created blew up in early July of 1969, the very month that America landed on the moon. They had this massive rocket. I forget how many engines were the first day, but 30-some engines. So any one of those blows up, the whole thing blows up. It was the largest explosion short of an atomic explosion. The whole thing, their launch pad, everything blew up. So they were in dire straits to win by July of 1969. But they sent a probe, and their probe was a Luna series, where these landers, and they had landed on the moon by that time with a non-manned lunar lander, and they were hoping to dig out some soil and at least beat America back so they could claim some glory or salvage some glory out of it. But this is I collect, by the way, when it comes to 20th century documents, I collect not just news clippings that I find them bulky and cumbersome, but actually press photos, original press photos, which have dates on them. They stamp the dates on them so you have original documents period. In this case, a lot of original NASA photos that are actually published by NASA, which is interesting if you see what's on them versus the way things are being portrayed today. But to back up now, America won the space race. This is I think the original's down there, but I blew it up so at least you can see it. This was published on the 21st of July of 1969. And it shows, this is the day after the astronauts landed and walked on the surface of the moon, and they were on their way back. But this is Apollo 11. This is the Sea of Tranquility. That's the sea in which the Americans landed. And they can see the American flag. That's very important. The American flag is there. And over here is Luna 15. USSR crashes. They don't land. They crash into a mountain in the Sea of Crisis. I think that's very telling. That's the destination of the two opponents. We land, successfully people on the moon and bring them back successfully, and they crash with a probe into a mountain. We were talking just briefly, I think, about people that deny the moon landing and whatnot. If you really get into it, it's kind of laughable to think that something this huge and magnificent theorists can say happened in a studio somewhere. I mean, this is 240,000 miles to the moon. People watched it take off. Americans were tracking it. British were tracking it. Australians were tracking it. And the Soviet Union was tracking it. They knew exactly where our probes were, where they landing, where they separated to go to the moon. Had we done that in a studio, we would have been laughed. And then the complexity and everything that went into it and the technology that had to be invented to do it. It all exists today. So I'm not going to cover the technology directly. There's a lot on that, and it just, as a geek, it fascinates me to no end. But I do want to plug the technology a little bit, because a lot of it happened here in St. Louis. I don't know if you're aware that all the Mercury capsules, which were the first manned orbital capsules launched by the United States, were all made here at McDonald in St. Louis by the airport. And then the Gemini was the second program, which is two-man ships with doors that open. The guys could go out and walk in space, and they could dock, and they could do things like that, which was a giant step towards being able to go to the moon. Those were all built in St. Louis, too, so there's a huge St. Louis connection to the technology. These are, this is an original NASA, so you can see it's an official NASA document, showing some guys at McDonnell Aircraft in St. Louis working on the Gemini. This goes to the technology. I don't know if you know, the early computers would fill a garage. I mean, they were huge computers. They actually made the first mini computers because they had on the Gemini capsule, they had to have what was considered a mini computer, so they consolidated it. Here's two McDonnell technicians changing out a computer in the Gemini capsule. That was amazingly small for the time. So they basically invented small technology, not carried it through the way we enjoy it today, but they set things in motion. That was a product of this. This is, in technology, this is one of Braun. We'll talk a little bit about him, a man who became a Christian, was in the Nazis in World War II, came to America, became a Christian, and headed up the Saturn program, which was the vehicle that launched. This is this is the first launching of a Saturn I rocket. This is rocket science. Credibility. This is the Von Braun didn't have anything to do with this. This was actually a early full-size model of the lander. This is years before the Apollo was launched. This is the first ship ever designed not to leave the Earth or launch from the Earth, but actually leave in lunar orbit and land on another heavenly body and come back and be utilized for that. So that's everything in the program. This is the first this. This is the first this. It just goes that way. To illustrate the complexity, this is an original schematic of the environmental system in the lunar landing. They had to invent the environmental system so people could breathe and have pressure in their cabins. I mean, it's amazing that they're inventing all this stuff from technology that did not exist yet. This is again, I'll just appreciate a little technology. This is a manual from 1967. These would have been internal. They had hundreds of these manuals published by NASA. This is actually the course that the first landing would have to take. This is what the astronauts would do. It has the charts, it has the diagrams, it has photographs, it has the whole plan of what they're to do when they land. To do it successfully, these are actually original NASA. You can't really see anything that look like slides, which they basically are. They're 70 millimeter slides created to train the astronauts. This is what your ship's going to look like. This is what the landing's going to be. They had to exercise and train in all this, again with technology that did not exist. Everything that happens today in the space program or the Space Force and all that borrows from all this. These guys invented this stuff, and it's amazing. They didn't know what the backside of the moon looked like. They didn't even have close-ups of what this side of the moon looked like. So they started sending probes. They couldn't hit the moon. They didn't know how to calculate how to hit the moon. They had many failures. So they had the Ranger program, 65, I believe. I don't know when the first successful one was. But this is just plowing a craft, obviously a manned craft, with 6 cameras into the moon. Just shoot it straight on, not orbit, not do anything like that. It took them forever to get that technology down. So these are some of the first photos, close-up photos of the near side of the moon. In fact, that is the first photo. And they had a series of photos they took, this rapid shooting. Well, that wasn't enough to come up with what the moon's like. So they sent the surveyor, which they figured out how to put a small craft in lunar orbit. So they did that, and if you think about how difficult that is, and the moon does not have a constant gravitational pull, so they have to calculate unbelievable. In fact, the first computers were typically women sitting in a room making calculations because they didn't have computers as we think of them. They called these women computers, and that's where we get the name. So they figured out how to land a craft on the moon. This is the Surveyor. This is Surveyor 3, because Surveyor 1 and 2 didn't make it. And they had problems launching these things because sometimes they get all the technology and the satellite worked out and the thing would blow up on the path. I mean, everything was in the works. So this is the first photo of the moon from the surface because they didn't know if they tried to land a craft on the Earth, it would sink in 6 feet of dust. Because according to evolutionary theory, there should be very thick dust on the moon. And they land Surveyor and it barely scratches the surface. There's a little bit of dust, which indicates, because there's no erosion or wind or anything on the moon to wash that stuff away, the moon's probably not as old as what evolutionary theorists predict. So they land on the moon. Surveyor 3, as this, you can't see this stuff, I'm just holding it up. You can come up later and look at it or whatever. They have a scoop on there. Okay, what's the soil like? Is it porous? So they actually scooped some up and they did tests on it. They sent Surveyor 5 because Surveyor 4 didn't make it to the Sea of Tranquility, which is important to us because that's where they eventually chose to land. So this is the first photograph of the Sea of Tranquility from the surface, and they find out what the area is made of. Then they send another couple, and this is the last one they sent to a more rugged area just to see. This is a surface photo of how rocky much of the moon is. It's just impossible to land. So they're trying to figure out how they can land, where they can land. Again, things that could be just calculated like that today, they had to invent through a lot of labor. Another component of the space race on the technology side, which I like, is because I'm a digital artist now, I used to do airbrush before there's Photoshop and all that. Now I use Photoshop. But the whole idea of digital photography didn't exist as we know it. So they want to send probes to deeper space. The first one was 1962, December. They sent a probe, not a camera, because they couldn't get signals back. Certainly nothing they could make a photograph from 40 million miles away. You can't just send waves back to the Earth because they can't pick them up. So they start using something called digital transmission. This is actually a little piece of the first digital transmission of a probe to another planet. This is actually it. This was sent to somebody who requested it. They sent it out and I purchased it later. By the time they go to Mars, in Mariner 4 mission, these things were not, they don't have viewfinders on these satellites, and let's get a picture of that. That doesn't, they have to pre-calculate before launch the exact time that this thing's going to be flying by Mars so they can take pictures, and they hope they come out. Well, Mariner 4 took 22 pictures of Mars. This is the best one, and they sent it back digitally. Numbers, and they had sheets that would be about as long as this room of all this coded number that then their computers would translate into digital images. So they got pictures of Mars, which shocked a lot of people because at the time people were thinking there's great civilizations that have evolved on Mars, and blah, 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 and they're like, it's like the moon, it's full of craters. It has an atmosphere, they proved that, but nothing that was sustaining life. But because it's digital, they could manipulate it, so they started manipulating. This is the first manipulation of digital photography decades before Photoshop. See how they're inventing this stuff as they go? Because they can send little dots. Then they later missions to Mars. These are two of the first color photos of Mars, so they're sending back signals that they can turn into color. This is, they land on the surface of Mars. This is the 70s, so this is after Apollo. But now digital photography is coming into its own, not for the public, but for technicians. This is a probe they sent to Jupiter, and they got these amazing pictures of Jupiter. This is one where they find out, these are just curiosities, but they're part of these, not the space race proper, but probing. This is the big, I'm sure you're familiar with the red spot, the giant red spot. This is an amazing close-up. This is all digital photography sent back over millions of miles. And they learn to fly. They learn to fly and sling around planets and gain speed by slinging around a planet or slowing down by slinging the other way around. These guys are magnificent in their technology. This is a close-up of Saturn, another close-up of Saturn, a real close-up of Saturn's ring. So it's amazing what they were able to do before Photoshop. And this led to what I enjoy today, the digital imaging. But they were doing it. They invented it. So how much stuff? That's just a spin-off, the whole digital revolution. Now, we come to the ideology, which is kind of where our heads are for this meeting. Again, I don't know of any other talk that's addressed that really. I certainly have. This is the first time I've ever talked on the subject. It fascinates me. You have to go, as Andrew alluded to, the two ideologies of the contestants, the Soviets and the Americans. The Soviets, again, America didn't say, we're going to do this Christian thing and go to the moon. That is not how it happened, but the Soviets played it to where atheism stood out. They're the ones that pitted themselves against God because they honestly thought, and I think I've talked on this before here, that science promotes communism. Religion promotes superstition. That's the basic thing, and superstition will get you so far, but it can't really get you into the real world, and that's the basic philosophy. It goes back to Marx. This is the first, one of only two copies that survive of Marx. Karl Marx, if you remember who he is, Communist Manifesto, founder of communism, he writes on religion in this little treatise, and this is the first translation into the Russian language of that, which Lenin and those guys read. But basically, it's religion is the opium of the people. You've heard that line. That's in that. I'll read you a little longer version of that if I can. I'll make do with this. Religion is the side of the oppressed culture, the heart of the heartless world, the soul of the soulless condition. It's the opium of the people. He goes on to criticize that. Religion is only the illusionary sun which revolves around man as long as it does not revolve around himself. It is therefore the task of history, once the other world of truth, that is, the world of religion, which he counts the superstition has vanished, and to establish the truth of this world. That's the worldview of totalitarian communism towards religion. And why would faith in God be a threat to them? Because they want to be absolute. There was a cult at the time, in the beginning of the 20s in the Soviet Union, that man is defectible. If we take our eyes off of the other world, or the spiritual world, or this idea of God, and focus on the hard realities of this world, that man can actually advance evolution and perfect ourselves. So they had this utopian idea. I'll get into the cult of the cosmos, but it's a very religious idea. It's a religious idea that man can perfect himself. So you just shift one faith system to another. See how that works? You'll never get away from man having faith in something, which is religious aspirations, because God put that in us. So, this is from the 20s, a poster of the Militant Atheist Society. It's a hugely influential group in the Soviet Union. This shows the ugly grandma, the old generation, trying to point the child to church, and the child's just reaching out to technology and the flying machine here, and the communists that are speaking of the new way and the new order and science. See how they oppose this idea of faith, the Bible, whatever, being opposed to science is a Marxist invention. Some of the great inventions and whatnot were done by Christians. Some of them read the Bible. That'd be another talk for another time. But what came out of that was the Young Pioneers, which is they imitate the Boy Scouts. They incorporated the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. These are the Young Pioneers. They have this certain salute. They wear this scarf. And they're learning Marxist principles. So the idea is that parents send their kids off to these meetings and whatnot, but what they learn is atheism. Here's a picture of an atheist. Used to be, I think, a cathedral. It's an atheist museum in Russia. These are the space program glorifies science versus religion. This was a poster done. If you look at the salute here, this was a supposed cosmonaut who says, they say it was Gagarin, but he didn't. Gagarin was the first cosmonaut, or first man, human being, to orbit the Earth. He says, we have looked high and low and found no gods or angels in heaven. That was designed, he's a smiling face, nice little guy, designed for his students to reinforce atheism. And so the Soviet space program was very much about promoting communism and the whole luster of the thing. The fact that they were first to do this and first to do that was to promote. Well, this is an actual poster from the early 60s. To the glory of communism. This is a cosmonaut. Yay, victory for communists. So this is what drove the ideology. And it was based on the cult that Marxism is scientific and America is dragging behind. We will not be able to catch up with them because we believe in God and freedom as we know it. So these are some handouts. You guys can all have one. It's the Soviet poster here. Again, designed for children in Russia, Soviet Union. It says, no God, and all the churches below. And I like this. This is the postage stamp that came back from an actual photograph of people that actually circled the moon and took that famous picture of Earthrise. And today, that Earthrise picture, if you look it up, is the inspiration for the environmental movement. I mean, that is its... And it's true, they saw how small the Earth was, but they were awed with the fact that God created this beautiful thing that they could look at from a distance and see. That's creation. So the U.S. came out with a postage stamp in the beginning of God. So you have atheism. Me as this person said, that's the ideology. That's the space race on the ideological front. No God, or God, not just any God, but in the beginning God, which is Scripture, God of Scripture. So the Americans believed in God, they believed in science, which proves the fallacy that science and faith do not get along. So that's the basic ideology. Back to this a little bit. This is, again, the first guy that walked the space. These were the guys, the United States didn't come up with the idea of the a little arm flag that all astronauts have. White, the guy who actually floated in space. This is a photograph that came back from Gemini of White floating in space, taken by the other astronaut capsule. But they actually themselves sewed American flags on their sleeves because they knew the lifeline. I think that's very appropriate when you look at the lifeline of the free world. So that's the basic outlines of what's at stake here. The free world, meaning people are free to enjoy entrepreneurship and the things that actually invent rockets and airplanes and fly men across the Atlantic for the first time. These aren't big government programs. These are entrepreneurs fascinated with things and enjoying the liberties. This is a news release from NASA. This is 1962, at the very beginning of the Apollo program. Again, get our programs right. There's Mercury, one-man capsules that at best circle the Earth, and they test out the health of men in space and whatnot. Then the Gemini, which actually has computerized spaceships that can move and whatnot, and they can dock, which is very important if you want to go to the moon, that kind of stuff. So the Gemini program, and then you have the Apollo program, which is 3 men in a capsule that eventually go to the moon and return. So the Apollo program is different than the Gemini program, but they all work together because they're all towards the same purpose. This is the head of the manned Space Flight Center at the time. And he goes into this technical, he's for the first time releasing how NASA and the Apollo astronauts are going to actually land on the moon, the program. This is the kind of ship we're going to have to make, this is how it's going to work. He says, although much of the discussion, this is a speech he gave, this evening will be on the nature of the description of our programs, the message I wish to bring to you for your consideration strikes close to the heart of our nation, our way of life. For today we're being judged in the world environment by our success in the conquest of space by man. It matters little that this should or should not be the case. It matters greatly that this fact is clear and that our failure to lead in this endeavor will well jeopardize our leadership among nations and may threaten the very precepts in which we believe and by which we live. That's kind of a summary of how they saw it. This is the head man of the space program. There's a lot at stake here. And it wasn't, again, that the United States pitted itself against Russian tyranny. They pitted themselves against us and we took the challenge. So with that said, that's what was laid out for us. And I'd like to get into just a little bit of the history of how this came about, which as a historian you like to know. This is a Harper's Weekly, which was the most famous photo magazine of the 1800s. And they have a big illustration of the moon before they actually published photographs of the moon. This is an engraving they had, full page, double page. This is remarkable that they had so many illustrations. This is an edition of 1859, and it concludes, we may someday have telescope powerful enough to see things on the moon as if they are across an ocean, but we will never, ever, ever, ever be able to land there. We will never be able to go. And that was the mindset. That was the mindset of almost every American up until about 1950 or beyond. In fact, I think there was a poll taken. Again, people were pretty optimistic that after Nazism was put down, the Cold War had started. Someone did a poll in America. 50% of people thought that we would come up with a cure for cancer. Only 15% of the people thought it was even possible to have human beings head to the moon. What happened was things like the airplane was in this original photograph of the first Wright flyer, 1903. By the way, my grandfather, James Ford, was 14 years old when this happened, so he was entering his semi-adult years. He lived to be in his 80s. I have a photograph of him in his carriage riding to see the first aerial plane land in Springfield, Illinois, which is close to where he lived. He was a farmer. He took his horse and buggy to see this first aerial plane land in 1910. And I got a picture of the aerial plane and the dynamics of that. He lived in his adult life. He lived into his 80s. When he was 80 years old, He doesn't have to go anywhere. He sits in front of his television set and watches live on TV as Americans walk on the moon. That's one man's lifetime. That may give you a great appreciation for what they did. Wright brothers, the moon landing, one person's lifetime. Another signal event was the Lindbergh flying solo across the Atlantic. That was big news, 1927, I believe. Our hero, so flight goes from the invention of a little airplane goes up to across the Atlantic, and they're doing amazing things with aerial planes by then. He was at the launch, by the way, met the astronauts before the Apollo 8, which is 40 years after his flight across the Atlantic. He's in Cape Canaveral talking to the astronauts, and they're laughing at the amount of fuel it took him to cross the Atlantic, and 20 tons of fuel that was burned in the first second of the Apollo launch. Just how crazy the technology was. The astronauts, how did you figure out how much fuel you needed? Well, we went to a library, because they had to build tanks for this airplane that Lindbergh flew. So we went to a library and got a globe and put a piece of string around it. Oh, we figured it's about 3,600 miles, so they built the tanks for that. That's the technology. Versus the Apollo program, which is like, it's amazing. Little St. Louis connection, the year after he flew across the Atlantic, they came out with this cool little airmail stamp, and he began flying out of St. Louis to Chicago, carrying the first email. These are 3 of the letters that he carried. They're reflectable now. Like them. FDR, when he became president, did not like Charles Lindbergh at all. Basically fired him from that. That's another story for another time. But now we've got to address rocket science, which is rocket science and rocket science. Another entrepreneur, again, the entrepreneurial spirit in America, you can look at Edison, you can look at other people, it's just amazing. Because we live in a free world and people are fascinated with how things work and how you can do things and whatnot. It's a natural impulse and outcome of freedom. This guy is Robert Goddard. This is the earliest known press photo of him. And he began tinkering with rockets, and he did something that no one else had done. He invented the liquid fuel rocket. Now we have the 4th of July, you light a solid fuel rocket. There's no turning it off, turning it on, there's no regulating it. And he figured if we have a liquid fuel rocket, you can calculate its motion, you can turn it off, you can turn it on, you can lower it. This is extremely rare. This is a photograph of his first liquid fuel rocket taken by his wife for writings on the back. She was the photographer, she was the brains of the operation, in my opinion, because he was a nerd. He liked to geek around with this stuff. She knew the historic importance, and she documented all this stuff. He was the first to send a camera on a rocket. He invented the parachute. He invented a multi-stage rocket. What I mean by invented, people theorized this stuff before. He actually did these things. But as we know, the New York Times is the best friend of entrepreneurs. The New York Times starts lampooning him in 1920, saying, oh, this guy's building moon rockets. Oh, this guy thinks you can put a camera. Oh, this guy, because Goddard came out with a little book on the possibilities of space flight. He said, someday we could possibly build a rocket and put a bomb on it that would blow up and light up, and you could possibly hit the moon with it. And if you have powerful telescopes and it's on the dark part of the moon, at the time, maybe we could see it. They just thought that was the funniest thing, and so the New York Times ran this guy into the ground. The first article against Goddard said every science teacher knows that you cannot fly in space because there's no atmosphere to push against, which is ludicrous. So he proves that's wrong. He really kind of goes into a shell because he did not like the bad publicity. But guys like Lindbergh and the Good Times funded him through the Depression and he continued his work. So he's getting bad press in America, the people that are noticing what he's doing. So the Soviets, this is a Soviet publication, and a big part of it's on what Goddard's doing. So, and the other people who were noticing what Goddard was doing were the Germans. They were very fascinated. They saw possibilities. They were not putting him down. So they formed space clubs and whatnot. I got to fast forward, but as we know, the Germans took rocket science under von Braun during the war to unbelievable extent with the B-2. You've probably heard of the B-2. But after the war, America is a very redemptive nation. America wanted to round up these scientists and bring them here, and England rounded up other German scientists. And these guys are valuable. They have a lot of valuable knowledge. The Soviets tried to round up, but the scientists preferred to surrender to Americans and British for obvious reasons. This is an original book by an interrogator, I wouldn't call him interrogator, an investigator of British Royal Air Force. And these guys are telling them all about the rockets they built. These are the original drawings of this guy. He's sitting with these Germans. So this is the first English. In America, I'm sure they did the same thing, that they would be classified. These photographs of some of the rocket components. The British actually, in a program called Backfire, I believe, actually took 3 of the German V-2 rockets and fired them into the ocean. And the Germans were more than happy to show them how they did it. In fact, this is a V-2. You can't see it from where you are. They hid V-2s in the woods before they surrendered. This is one. So they came up with this German rocket development. Well, this advanced rocket science in America by leaps. And so America started modeling that, and then they had the lead scientists, including Braun, who was forced to be in Nazi Party. We can get into the von Braun controversy. I'll sum up the von Braun controversy. You know who Dwight Eisenhower was. He was the commander of all the Allied forces in Europe. He was president when von Braun came to the White House, and there were people in the White House arguing at the time, we don't want all these ex-Nazis and these Germans doing anything with our space program. And at one point with von Braun outside the Oval Office, and this big argument going on in the Oval Office, Dwight Eisenhower said, yes, they were all Nazis during the war, and they're all free now. Basically, get over it. This is a redemptive nation. You don't take people because they're German and say they can't be used. They're useful people. So von Braun came, he was kind of a ladies' man in Germany. He wasn't a Christian yet. He was often seen with a girl on each arm, you know. He was a good-looking guy and all that. He came to America and visited his church. The first place they put these 100 or so scientists in America is Fort Bliss, which is in the desert in Texas. And he ran into these Christians who invited him to church. And he saw Christianity in a way he'd never seen it before. He accepts the Lord Jesus Christ, and the rest is history. So now we have these Christians involved in these things. This is a publication by the very guy who took these German notes, and he concludes by 1950 how we shall reach the moon. So these guys are visionaries, not just for rockets, for ballistic missiles and military use, but von Braun and all these guys that are still in these space clubs, little clubs like this that they speculate they designed what a spacesuit might be, or a spacesuit that's going to land on the moon. They're very visionary, and it influences von Braun a lot to become public about his desire to have rockets circle. We'll get into more of that. So von Braun goes to Redstone Arsenal from Fort Bliss, and all his scientists go there. This is an arsenal from World War II, and they established Marshall Space Flight Center. This is the retained copy of the first book from them that says we are now Rocket City. So you've heard of Huntsville, Alabama being Rocket City. This is the beginning of that, 1950s. I love the redemptive quality of this. This is von Braun. These would have been classified at the time, but for some reason Marshall sold off their library, and I bought some of the things. But this is von Braun meeting Omar Bradley, who commanded the American ground troops. That was the Army. So here you have the leading scientists of the Germans meeting and being greeted well by the Americans. This would have been definitely classified because it shows them working on a rocket in Huntsville, 1952. Here's Omar Bradley and von Braun. This is another photo from the same collection. I just love these things because I like to fill in the little history things. This was another photograph of the comedian Matthew Ridgway, who was responsible for Korea being free, if you know the story of the Korean War. All that said, the 1955 newspaper clipping, U.S. will launch satellites in 1958. So it wasn't that America wasn't planning it. They were planning it from 1955 on. They were going to do it. So all the Russians had to do was beat the timeline. It looks like they're ahead of us, and that's exactly what they did in launching Sputnik. Dwight Eisenhower, our president, wanted to make sure it didn't look like a military rocket, so he didn't want the Redstone rocket being the one to fire into space the first time. He wanted it to look like it's peaceful. He wanted to do scientific experiments. The Russians could care less about any of that. They just used the best scientists and said they put up a satellite called Sputnik. There's a picture of it, and they made great hay on it in their propaganda. You know, the glory of communism rises above America, that kind of stuff. And also their satellite, they went beep, 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 but it proved it went around the world, the little globe. America tried to use a non-military satellite. This is 1957, by the way, October. This is the next month. America tries to send its satellite up, and here it is blowing up on the pad, which gets to the difference again, a key difference between the American space program and the communists. We do everything transparently. We see our flaws. We put this out for everybody to look. The Russians wouldn't tell you what they were doing. If they had something blow up, it'd never make the press. They had a success. It's the glory of communism. See the difference? You'll find that, by the way, in any socialist, and we find that in America today. The Marxist, socialist, tending people are very good at optics. They're all about optics because they don't have substance, or good substance. Whereas true freedom-loving people say, this is what it is, flaws and all, this is what we are. So this is a news press date, 1997, December. It says Sputnik, oh what a flopnik. The US calls it Kaputnik. And so they had all these nicks, which the idea stuck. You've heard beatniks, that's where that term comes from, somebody that's something in it. Beatnik. Everything's a nick then, because nick became that idea for something that's cool or not cool. So that's the effect of Sputnik, and to rub American space in it, Time Magazine made Nikita Khrushchev Man of the Year, January 1958. That's rubbing our face in it when the press. You can't do it. The Russians can. So they take the lead. America forms the space program, forms NASA, which is a civilian, decidedly civilian organization because they don't want to look like our military is theirs. 1958, this is the first astronauts coming to St. Louis because that's where the Mercury capsule will be. This is a cool picture. Extremely rare. I've got a couple copies of it. But this is Mr. Mack, the guy that founded Mack aircraft. These are the 7 right stuff astronauts coming to visit. He's standing by a model that wasn't perfected yet. This guy is important. He's up at Waldenberg. He was in charge of the Mercury and the Gemini programs, building the capsules. This is what he says. He's an evangelical Christian. He says, I have found nothing in science or space exploration to compel me to throw away my Bible or reject my Savior Jesus Christ in whom I trust. The space age has been a factor in deepening my own spiritual life. I read the Bible more now. I get more from the Bible what I cannot get from science. The really important things of life. This is the guy who built the spacecrafts that went into orbit. St. Louis and worked for McDonald. So we see the idea of him embracing it. He sees the contest, or else he would speak that way. Nonetheless, the opportunist Soviets were the first to send an astronaut. This is Yuri Gagarin, is his name. He was the first man to orbit. America had the capability to do it, but they were being very conservative, make sure we want to focus on safety. Well, if you don't care about optics, if you send a couple cosmonauts up and they die, you just don't report it. You wait until one succeeds. You don't worry about the safety. America, being transparent, worried about that. So they beat us. This is Khrushchev making hay about making fun of actually America because he said we're sending satellites the size of grapefruit while we're sending men into orbit. wave of the communist revolution, our next endeavor is to rise into space. So America's program continues to endeavor to put astronauts in orbit. These are some early drawings. This is a mock-up of a capsule right here in St. Louis. I'm going to hop, skip, and jump a little bit. There's some neat photos that geeks like me like. But there was a program which gets to, I think, the heart of the space race called Project Horizon. It was classified at the time and declassified. I found some original illustrations of the program, but this was a program, and it's very important to understand the significance of this. Not that we want a military base on the moon, but they wanted to put a military base on the moon. And why was that? These are some drawings of what they thought it might look like. And this is a declassified, so this isn't original, it's not original. But it gets at what's at stake here, because there's more at stake than what we may think. America wanted the moon to be the property of everybody, because it's really God's property. America cannot own the moon. The Soviets had a different idea. From the viewpoint of national security, the primary implications of a feasible establishment of lunar outposts was the importance of being first. The political reasons, anything but being short of the first lunar surface would be catastrophic. Being first will have so much political significance that no one can say at this time what the absolute effects will be. However, it is apparent from past space accomplishment that being second again cannot be tolerated. The Soviet Union has announced openly its intention, this is 1959 by the way, so 10 years before we land on the moon. The Soviet Union has announced openly its intention that some of its citizens will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the communist government in 1967 on the surface. The United States intelligence community agrees that the Soviet Union may accomplish a manner of lunar landing at any time after 1965. World opinion may be expected to view the other applications similar to actions on the high seas, and also to view the establishment of the first lunar outpost similar to proprietary rights derived from first occupancy. What they're saying here is, if the Soviets beat us to the moon, they will claim the moon as their territory. And that's what was at stake. So there's hard legal realities at stake here. So the United States wanted to be there not to claim proprietary rights, but make sure that no one else that lands there can, because we've set the precedent. That's the core of what it is. So when you hear Neil Armstrong say, tranquility base here, the Eagle has landed, that has political significance. Because what that means is we have now established a base of freedom on the moon, and we represent the free world. See how significant that is not a small thing. Had the Soviets landed first, because every time you look at the moon, I want you to think of how glorious communism is. And we threw out God, and now we are there. That was the stake. Now, Project Horizon was rejected by President Eisenhower for good reasons. Again, he didn't want a military base on the moon, and that's what he proposed. But that didn't mean we weren't trying to establish a base on the moon for the sake of freedom and for the sake of saving that wonderful thing that God put in the sky for our nightlight from being claimed by anybody other than Him. So that's really what's at stake. Never heard anybody else flush it out like that, but that's really, from a Christian viewpoint, what was at stake. And these guys internally were aware of that. America sent the first astronaut into space, Alan Shepard. This was the launch of his vehicle. It only went up a few hundred miles and a few hundred miles into the Atlantic. But it was a huge thing for the free world. Yeah, we put a man in space. Here he is coming with James Webb, visiting Mayor Tucker. If you've heard of Tucker Avenue, James Tucker was the mayor at the time. They came to St. Louis to visit the plant, celebrate that. Our first astronaut to orbit. Oh, by the way, his spaceship, which the astronauts named themselves, was called Freedom 7, because there were 7 astronauts. So freedom versus tyranny. See how it's self-consciously derived. Friendship 7 was John Glenn. Here's a picture of him outside his capsule before he launched. Here he is by Gunther Wendt, who's a German engineer that helped all the astronauts enter the capsule. England loved him. Here he is being put in. Here's the first orbiting astronaut. They have a little camera so they can see the American orbiting. And I love this picture because it's an official NASA publication. But it says on the back, this is NASA's words, perhaps the most dramatic few minutes of NASA's 5-year history are shown by Dr. W.K. Douglas, the astronaut's physician, as he prays for the safe return of John Glenn Jr., February 20th, 1962. That was self-consciously put out. We are a space program that's fortified by prayer. Not denying God, but relying upon Him. This is an official NASA photograph. I love that as a Christian. That was Friendship 7, the last of the Mercuries with Gordon Cooper's Faith 7. He said, I want to call it Faith 7. And NASA had a little bit of trouble with that because if it blows up on the pad, it's going to blow up on the pad. But he goes, no, it's my call. He insisted I wanted Faith 7 and it worked. And it was, his capsule was put on display, and I love this because it shows kids all around it looking, they can look up and see what it looks like and all this, because again, the American space program is transparent. Literally, there's plexiglass that they can look through. See that? So it inspired a lot. I wasn't going to show this, but here's your typical Norman Rockwell interpretation. These are American kids building their own space rocket. That's my generation. We played with those ideas. Boy, I'm running out. I'm going to speed this up. Soviets continued to put out their propaganda. Again, optics are everything to socialists, as we know in current politics. This is huge banners in Moscow being put up to celebrate the fact that they walked in space before us, which was by month only because it came out later. The cosmonaut almost died because they didn't really know what they were doing. This is the first photograph of the entire Holy Land from outer space, which is pretty cool. If you're a Christian, it shows the Sinai Peninsula, the Dead Sea, Israel. This is where America starts to catch up and actually surpass. Gemini has 2 ships flown together, they dock. They don't dock, they rendezvous. Rendezvous is where they get close to each other and they park and go around the world together. That's very difficult to do. This is the mission control where they celebrate, and they always celebrated by putting American flags on their consoles. All up and down, which is, again, very self-conscious. This is the actual first docking, which you've heard of Neil Armstrong. He was actually an astronaut in the Gemini program. This is a spaceship actually docking. Again, these are things very important and groundbreaking. This is the only photograph, and it's blurry because as soon as they dock, this thing starts spinning out of control. So they detach themselves from what they docked, and they start spinning. They figure they're going, in fact, it's on film, 1 revolution a minute. These guys are about to lose consciousness and die. Neil Armstrong, being steady Eddie, pulls a switch that fires a rocket that stops that. No one in the flight plans knew how to do that. It's just instinctively, as a fighter pilot, he knew to do that. But the savior was this. This is out of his personal collection. I collected things from his collection because he saved souvenirs. This is while he was up in space during Gemini 8, his parents' church had a prayer vigil. All the time he was in space, they had people in his church praying. This was given to him as a souvenir because the space program would have gone down the toilet had they died. Because they wouldn't have the ship to see what went wrong. The fact that they survived, they could investigate. It was kind of a minor thing, but a big deal. Nonetheless, we're going to go towards the Apollo program, which is a big rocket. Most powerful engines in the history of the world. The Soviets are still, again, all about propaganda, how they are ahead, laughing at us. This is one of the early launching of an Apollo, or Saturn rocket, which is amazingly, there was not one of these that failed, which is unbelievable if you understand how complicated these things were. I like this. This is the first picture of what became the Space Flight Center in Houston. Houston, we have a problem. They open it, Houston opens it with a prayer service. This is a prayer service, inviting NASA to Houston, saying, we're going to bathe you and bathe our program in prayer to God. Again, so they're self-conscious of this. I've got other pictures. Oh, this is the early picture of the Saturn V. This thing is massive, massive, massive rocket. And it worked every time. I'm going to fast forward to for the sake of time and your attention, Apollo 8 was the first time that human beings went beyond Earth orbit. It took a massive ship to do that. This is the pre-flight photograph top-down of Apollo 8. This is the third stage. This was actually a picture illustration done here in St. Louis because the third stage was made by McDonald as well. I like these because this is on TV again, talking about microcomputers. I mean, that are this big, you know, they reduce a room-sized computer down to that. They also put mini cams. They weren't that small, but they had them on board so they could have live shots. So we got to see astronauts live as they're leaving Earth orbit, heading for the moon for the first time. These are NASA put out these video feed, or pictures of the video feed. This is the commander, Borman, kind of waving to the camera. You don't know if he's saying hi or bye. You know, he's heading out. It's another picture of him flying. This is the photographer on board holding his lens. I like this one. He's holding his toothbrush. They had to have all kinds of equipment on board. This is Lovell saying, "Happy birthday, Mom." They're photographing the Earth from the first time. This is amazing stuff. Again, you watch Star Wars, and it's just you get your, Chewbacca's over here, and you just fly as if that's not reality. It takes a lot of precise technology to do these kinds of things. So that's Apollo 8, the first live pictures of people orbiting. This is live. They have press conferences from these spaceships. This is the last picture. This is signed by Lovell. This is at the tail end of them reading Genesis 1. I don't know if you know the story of reading Genesis. There is the astronauts were told before they blast off, the whole world's going to be watching. This is Christmas Eve, 1968. Say something important. I don't know. Say, what do you say? So they asked a guy who asked his wife. He's a Christian. She's a Christian. She goes, because he kept trying to come up with something pithy or something from the Bible, and nothing worked. She goes, why don't you just start with Genesis? Well, these guys are going around the moon, and if you go around here's the moon, we're here. You go around the moon, you're going to see the Earth appear to rise. It really doesn't rise when you stand on the moon. If you're on the surface of the moon, the Earth is always where it is. It never moves. It goes around like this. You see night and day, but if you're standing on the moon. But you're coming around this way, you see the Earth. They're the first ever to see that. On the next orbit, they're reading Genesis. And the picture they got, which I got this one that's signed by two of the guys there. This is a famous, I'm sure you've seen, it's probably the most famous 20th century photograph, which they made the stamp from, by the way, in the beginning of God, because these guys quote Genesis. The Earth was void and without form. You see the moon here, you see how magnificent God's creation is. I mean, and then they read Genesis. This is not set up by anybody but God. I mean, it is so cool because it flies in the face of the whole Soviet. These guys succeed in their honor of God. That gets me as a Christian. Well, not every American liked it. This is Madden Murray O'Hare, who files a lawsuit saying these are government employees. They should not be able to quote Scripture. And she files a lawsuit. Fast forward to the lawsuit's thrown out. It goes up to the courts. And one of the courts, I don't know that it made it to the Supreme Court, one of the courts say what people do beyond the Earth is a little bit above our jurisdiction. Which is perfect reasoning. They can say what they want. That has application today, by the way. People should be able to say what they want, even on government time. Because she said, we're on government time. This is Christmas Day, the next day after they read Genesis. This is Frank Borman, the commander's wife, going to church, and she's given a tape of what they said. And she says that's the most thrilling gift she's ever had. Christmas gift. They bring back photographs, as we saw, of the moon. These are the first human beings to see the backside of the moon. Again, awesome stuff. This is really cool. This is an actual piece of film. This slide was made by the guy who developed that picture. This was his own copy of that picture, so that's a pretty cool artifact. Don't have time to get into that, except we're going to get into Apollo here. So, Apollo 9 tested out the landing module as it circled the Earth. So they had, again, step by step, incredible amount of technology and time and patience and endeavor, and everything had to work. Something doesn't work, they're dead, and it's a failure. But it's remarkable. It is an answer to prayer that this thing worked. So here's the Apollo 10 actually went to the moon, did everything but land. They had lunar mileage separate and come back, and that was incredible in itself, took great pictures. But Apollo 11 is the key. Now we're coming to the end of the space race. This is the announcement of the astronauts. It's just a little late for me in the evening. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins are the guys chosen to do it. Here they are. Adios, guys. This is the morning of July 16th, 1969. This is one of the things. These are in black and white because that's how NASA published them at the time. I mean, you can get them in color online. They came back and it was such a sensation in the press and people watching TV. They figured about 600 million people saw it, sometimes on a big screen in India. That 600 million people watched this. They got back and Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong, who walked the moon, said, "We missed it all. Meaning we missed all the hubbub." So NASA prepared for Armstrong clippings. This is the actual clippings they gave to him. This was in his private collection. Clippings of the day after they left, and the news stories of how fantastic it was. They took pictures of the Earth on their way out. This is Michael Collins' family. What did they do the day that the astronauts walked on the moon? They went to church and worshiped the Lord. So I like that in the collection. This is an actual NASA slide that was given to Neil Armstrong after he returns, showing the first photograph he took on the surface of the moon. So this is actually the one that was given to him, a NASA slide that was used in the debriefing. Okay, what was it like to land on the moon? And so to honor him, they gave him a series of slides. This is the first one taken out of his window. This is from the surface when he walks, but they didn't know they were going to walk. If they landed and had to take off, they went in photos. So they took pictures out the window. So it's kind of a crude picture, but it's pretty neat. The first food eaten on the moon, because they were going to eat before they went, took their walk. We call it EVA, extra vehicular activity. But the first food that was eaten on the moon, Buzz Aldrin, who had communication back and forth to technical people. Buzz Aldrin asked an indulgence to talk to the American people. And he said Americans should give thanks. And he had prearranged with his church that he would take a little cup. This is his pastor, by the way. He would take a little cup in his ditty bag, a little wine, a little bread. And the specific time when he said it's time to give thanks, his church celebrated communion. So the first drink on the surface of the moon was communion wine. The first food ever eaten on the surface of the moon. So now we have the redemption story. We had the creation story of Apollo 8, now we have the redemption story on the surface of the moon. And this picture of Buzz Aldrin's pastor was given to Neil Armstrong. This is the copy that was given to Neil Armstrong, who was in the capsule with him, who was doing businessy things while Buzz was celebrating communion, which I think is cool. Again, these little history tidbits go to the story. This, again, is part of the answer to Neil Armstrong missing the whole thing. They gave him press releases of what happened. This is I think, the best selfie in the 20th century. It's Neil Armstrong alone on the surface of the moon. No one had been there before. He had to pull a lever so a camera would come down so that we could watch it live. And this is him. He comes down, takes his first step, and he walks towards the camera, like gets real close to it. This is a good picture. What'd you do on your summer vacation? Oh, we went to the moon. It's amazing. Here's a picture from the same. Again, we were watching these live on TV, middle of the night, by the way, which was remarkable because I don't know if you knew TV used to be three networks. I mean, and about 10:30 after the news, they'd sign off, and you get the. Well, not on this night. They were doing NASA feeds 24/7. This is Buzz Aldrin's first step. This one I like a lot. These were all given to Neil Armstrong as mementos. This is how we saw it. This is Buzz and Neil planting the American flag. That's so cool. because that represents free, non-American ownership. Who owns the moon? The God that allowed them to get there. But America's flag being there means no one else can have proprietary rights to this thing. God alone owns what he creates, and America acknowledges that. This is a higher res, because they had 70 millimeter cameras. So this isn't live feed. These pictures were brought back. This is a signed picture of Buzz Aldrin saluting the flag, because his dad said, Buzz Aldrin's dad said, I want you to salute the flag there. So he's saluting the flag, which became a tradition with astronauts, you'll see. On their way back, Buzz Aldrin, this is again a TV feed of him. Each of the three astronauts spoke something, and he reads, and I should have pulled it out. Yes. Buzz Aldrin, in the face of Madame Murray O'Hare, reads this. This is his reaction to going to the moon. When I consider the heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars, which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? And the Son of Man that thou visitest him. He's reading scripture about how magnificent God is and how small we are. And these guys got a picture of it, because when the Apollo astronauts are there, they go, what's the Earth look like? Oh, wait a minute, I gotta find it. Wait a minute, you gotta find the Earth out. They realize how small and fragile we are in the cosmos that God created, and how blessed we are to live here. And he quotes this scripture. I love that, because that's true sentiments. This is the first picture. Again, this is the reason this is in this thing. It's the copy given to Neil Armstrong as a souvenir. Neil Armstrong was the first one to stand on a heavenly body, look back to Earth, and take a photograph of the Earth. This is the photograph. You can come up and see that in detail. So we get a picture of the Earth from the moon, which is cool. The only artifact I have, because they're hard to get, and I'm really into the Apollo photography, these are little pieces of the actual film that was on the moon. The pictures that were given to the film that was given to the astronauts and subsequent to that are copies of the first copies. The first copies are in vaults in Houston, and but the guy who developed the film kept the leaders of the film that was on the moon. These are three little pieces of things that were actually on the moon. There are three different roles. We don't have time to get into that. We won the space race. We had that picture earlier. I love this. Mission control. The American flag's flying everywhere. I just love that. That idea of patriotism reigned. Here's your St. Louis Globe Democrat. Our heroes are home when they land. Color printing wasn't common then. Here's Madame Murray O'Hare again. She got a sticker nose in all the business. She has another lawsuit. She claimed that America should have admitted that Neil Armstrong was atheist. She files a lawsuit. This is the guest where they had a homecoming for Neil at his hometown, and they have the reception in the church, which I find interesting for the atheist, right? Where he went to church. This is a picture. I don't know if you guys are, what do they call it, first day covers? Familiar with that in stamp collecting, where you have the first day of stamps out. This guy actually took a photograph of Neil's church and had it stamped. The astronauts went to Washington, as you can imagine, for the unveiling of the stamp. And the completion of the mission was at least the way they looked at it, was the three astronauts spoke before Congress. They gave a picture of them giving flags. They actually took American flags to the moon and came back and gave them, full-size flags that flew over Congress. They gave them back to Congress because that's who made it possible for them to go. This is a first day cover, and this is Neil Armstrong's copy of his speech that he gave. And he says on the third page, he talks about it was right for people to criticize the mission, all that. To those of you who have advocated looking higher, we owe our sincere gratitude, for you have granted us the opportunity to see some of the grandest views of the Creator. That's an atheist, supposedly. Monroe O'Hare said, you can't say those things. But he says that before Congress, and I'm going to touch just briefly on that. Neil Armstrong was a coin collector and metal collector. This is a coin that he collected that came out the year after they landed on the moon. This is 1970, which is the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing that has on this side the Pilgrim ship, the Mayflower. On this side it shows the first man coming and stepping on Plymouth Rock. And you can see the significance because you have the Mayflower, the mothership, in the harbor. When Neil's landing on the moon, you have the mothership up there, and you have the man stepping out. And why this would appeal to Neil was he never made a big deal about him being the first. He said the mission was important. And that's exactly what we find in the Mayflower. It didn't matter who the first one off the Mayflower to step on Plymouth Rock was. The fact that they did it in the name of freedom is the important thing. So Neil collected this. This was his copy of that medal that they associated themselves with that kind of landmark event for freedom. And I love that tie-in. So that's the mission itself. I have other things, moon rocks and stuff. We don't have time to get into that. But I would like to fast forward now to, not that there's a space race, but there's significant importance of space in the program. And I know that with the Space Force and whatnot, those are not laughing matters because we have an opponent. And that happens to be Communist China. This is a rare, when Mao was alive, they were wanting to put men in space. Chinese, this is a very rare button. And they show their goal. It's interesting that they have to borrow American pictures, which they did, but they use this as a famous picture. They had the Youth League. They have young pioneers in China. I didn't show you the Soviet. Where the Soviet children learned atheism. This was a young pioneer's flag. This would be flown in parades of the young pioneers who learned to be not only communists but atheists. And that idea was picked up in China. This was the same thing, young pioneers in China now. And it's the parents give their kids to the state teaches them about things like atheism. In fact, the current Xi Jinping says the weakness of America, it'll usher in our downfall, is the fact that we hold on to the idea of God. Nonetheless, our space program was open in the 70s when the space shuttle was being planned. An entourage of Chinese astronauts and the premier came to NASA and they showed them openly what they're doing with the space shuttle. They took notes, as the Chinese always do. These are actually NASA photos of the Chinese looking at our shuttle operation. This is Fred Hayes, one of the Apollo 13 astronauts, explaining and being translated, oh, this is how we're going to do this space shuttle thing. So they're imitating, and of course, they came out with posters. Now, if you look at the top of this, you might think that's a Christian inspirational picture, right? The Chinese picture, which they copied the space shuttle idea, borrowed from us, space program, it says, in reference to the old Marxist idea, uphold science, eradicate superstition. Again, their space program is about what the Russians were. We're going to pit science against faith. And look how inspirational it is. Because it's a cult. Marxism is a cult that man can perfect himself. The irony is, if you remember the original quote from Karl Marx is, we're not concerned with the heavens, we're concerned with things on earth. But they're using the same philosophy now to conquer the heavens. Isn't that ironic? This is science is the means of production. Again, these are meant to inspire the Chinese youth. Again, science versus religion, and Karl Marx being their hero, who was against religion. And this is an innocent poster for the young pioneers. That young pioneers wear the same scarves. In fact, this is a picture of the Chinese little propaganda stuff. You can be a young Chinese pioneer. You see the scarf there. We love science. Again, ... versus superstitious religion. See how that works. So the same forces are in play today that were in play at the beginning of the space race. That's our challenge. Now, America can't go woke, can't go off in Looneyville and forget our mission, which our mission is to uphold freedom and the principles of freedom. It's not just this theory. It's very common for people, libertarians, whatever, to speak about freedom as this is a theoretical thing. It's a concrete thing that was given to us by the endeavors of people that sacrificed a lot. here's the first Chinese man in space to fly, to walk in space. And he's given the young pioneer salute. Again, this is all about atheism and communism. So we have to understand these principles are dear to us. If we reject God in our nation, if we reject history, we're talking about holding our principles. Also, prayer is massively important for us. Because we may be small groups, but small groups that pray are huge to saving this whole thing. So we have the task for us to save our country again, as you mentioned at the beginning. It's an endeavor that will never stop because we're Americans. Americans fought for freedom from the beginning, and we will continue to fight. Those of us who understand what it's made of have a special obligation to uphold it, to teach, to write, and to speak out against the challenges we face. So I think I'll end on that for now. I don't know if we have time for a few questions. Oh man, I ran really late.
You're good. We can just keep questions to if anyone wants when they're coming up and looking at the documents.
I'm sorry, I was reading it an hour wrong.
No, it was perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ford. That was fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I think I speak on behalf of everybody that was remarkable. And I'm listening to this the whole time and I'm thinking, you got to write a book on this. You got to write a book on this. I think that would be fantastic because I've never heard a lot of this stuff. I knew about the prayer, or not the prayer, I knew about the Genesis being read, I knew about the communion, but when it comes to all these little details about the faith of these guys, like behind the men who are making the mercury capsules and everything, that's just fascinating. The St. Louis connection, I've lived here my whole life, I didn't know any of that St. Louis connection. So that's fantastic. Let's give Mr. Ford one more round of applause. You're okay with people kind of coming up and looking? All right. That's a great thing. And I hope you understand how much of a gift this is to be able to listen to this with these documents that Mr. Ford's collected and researched. He's coming here as a volunteer giving up his time for us to be able to listen to that. So we're so grateful. Thank you so much. I just wanted to say one thing before we close about the St. Louis Teen Eagles, because I can see a couple new faces here. Teen Eagles, which is the group that you're here with tonight. We meet once a month currently. What we are is we're a group of Christian conservative students that have a biblical Christian worldview. We care about America's Christian heritage. We care about our Constitution. And we see that the next generation needs to step up and do something to try to save that, to try to preserve our history and our heritage and our Constitution. Because I know for me, when I meet my Creator face to face, I don't want to be held guilty for not taking my responsibility of where I've been placed and the freedoms I've been given seriously. So if you're a student or you're a parent and you want to come to our meetings and our events, you're always more than welcome to. There's a sign-up sheet in the back. You can get on our mailing list. I also want to say that Teen Eagles has always met on the second Monday of the month here in this room. And we've always just kind of done a second Monday of the month, once a month, lecture-type meeting where we have a guest speaker, and we're going to continue to do that. But we just want to expand what we're doing a little bit. So we're going to open up and kind of reimagine not the vision of Teen Eagles, not the mission of Teen Eagles, but just the execution a little bit. And we're going to start meeting weekly in addition to having meetings and events and lectures, be able to work together as students to create content, write articles, make videos, go to conferences, events, read books, have discussion on current events, just in a little bit more of a casual group workshop-like setting on a weekly format during the day. That's going to be held at Pillar. So all that to say, for our next meeting on the second Monday of the month, November 14th, we are going to be talking about that and presenting to you kind of our vision for what we want to do with Teen Eagles, not changing the mission or our vision at all, but just expanding the execution because we believe that this mission is important and what Teen Eagles stands for, which is America's Christian heritage, the biblical worldview, and just trying to get that message out, cultivating leaders. That's what we're about. All of our meetings are executed and planned by a student leadership team, and we want to just continue to create leaders to change and impact our culture. So if you're interested in that, sign-up sheet in the back. Again, our next meeting, we'll be discussing that. Also, we have an election coming up. And though many of us cannot vote as students, we still want to be involved. And a part of that's prayer, a part of that's research, and a part of that's educating others. We have these voter guides that are in the Frontline publication, and we're giving those out for free. These are in the back, just information on candidates, different things. If you want to grab some of these, goes through the different amendments that are going to be proposed for the Missouri Constitution candidates. You can get research on that. And there's also a lot of other good information. Those are in the lobby for you if you want one of those for free. Take as many as you want. Give them to people. So again, glad you're here. Some cookies in the back if you want to stay and fellowship and talk. Look at the documents, talk with Mr. Ford. Thank you so much for being here. God bless you, and have a great evening.